July 3, 1863. The fields of Gettysburg burned with smoke and the screams of dying men. As cannon fire tore the earth apart and Pickett's doomed charge surged forward, something else walked among the wounded, something that should not exist. Elizabeth Caldwell, a woman who appeared as if time itself had forgotten her. Soldiers swore she looked exactly as she had 2 decades before, unchanged, untouched by age, her pale hands steady as she bound their wounds. Imagine a face you first saw in your youth, reappearing in your adulthood without a single wrinkle, without the faintest touch of decay. That was Elizabeth Caldwell, a living fracture in reality. Official records confirm it. Baltimore midwives in the 1840s documented her presence at births. Army surgeons in 1863 logged her work at field hospitals. Local church registries carried her name across decades, unaltered, and yet the United States Army Medical Department classified her file as restricted in 1864 and sealed it for nearly 100 years. Why? Because what she represented was more than a medical curiosity. She was living proof of something institutions fear most, a truth that cannot be controlled. Before we go further, listen carefully. This story is not entertainment, it is a test. If you are hearing these words, it means you were meant to stumble across this forgotten case. Subscribe now, not for me, but for yourself, because what we are about to unearth has been buried by powers greater than you imagine. And in the comments, type your state, your country, or the place you call home. Stamp your presence into this moment. Let it be known that you bore witness to Elizabeth Caldwell's forbidden story. And if you understand the gravity of what you are about to hear, type the words, "The veil is broken," twice. Seal it into yourself, because make no mistake, the story of the woman who never aged is not a fairy tale. It is not folklore. It is not a miracle. It is a wound in history itself, one that the medical establishment, the military, and even the church worked tirelessly to conceal. And her tale does not begin at Gettysburg. It begins in the shadowed, gaslit streets of Baltimore in the autumn of 1840, where the first whispers of her impossible existence began to stir. Baltimore, 1840, a city swollen with ambition and disease, where the cobblestone streets groaned under the weight of immigrants, merchants, and secrets too dark for polite conversation. Steamships docked daily, spilling thousands into a place where medicine fought a constant losing battle against cholera, typhoid, and fever. Yet within this crucible of human suffering, a young physician named Dr. Cornelius Hartwell encountered a patient who would consume the next 23 years of his life. Elizabeth Caldwell. She came to his Charles Street clinic complaining only of fatigue, a common ailment for women of her class. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, was a shipping magnate whose firm supplied goods from Virginia plantations and northern mills, ensuring the family's place among Baltimore's respectable elite. By all appearances, she was a woman of about 28 years, auburn-haired, green-eyed, unremarkable, except for something Dr. Hartwell could not name, something unsettling that would only reveal itself with time. For decades, Hartwell kept meticulous records of his patients. His journals survive today in the archives of Mercy General Hospital, brittle pages inked with observations as precise as surgical incisions. And year after year, Elizabeth Caldwell's file remained unchanged, height 5'4", weight steady save for fluctuations during childbirth, bone density consistent with a woman in her 20s. Skin, hair, eyes, untouched by time. For 10 years, for 20 until the impossible could no longer be dismissed. Other physicians, summoned to her bedside during childbirth or seasonal illness, corroborated the same anomaly. She was not aging at the rate of an ordinary woman. Some whispered she aged at 1/3 the pace. Others argued she did not age at all, and yet her life unfolded as if nothing were amiss. She bore 3 children, Margaret, Thomas, Gina, between 1842 and 1848. Each delivery carefully noted by attending doctors who recorded not only the health of mother and child, but the disturbing fact that Elizabeth looked no older at the 3rd birth than at the 1st. By the 1850s, whispers spread through Baltimore's social circles. How was it that Mrs. Caldwell looked as radiant at 40 as she had at 25? Society matrons murmured about exotic cosmetics or secret treatments imported from Europe, but none could name a powder, tincture, or potion capable of such perfection. Only Reverend Samuel Wickham, her Presbyterian minister, dared put words to the unease. In his diary he wrote, She appears immune to the hand of time. And if this is providence, it is a form that defies mortal comprehension. As the 1850s unfolded, Baltimore itself became a city divided, a place where politics and commerce blurred with shadows. The Mason-Dixon line was not simply a boundary, it was a fault line running directly through every household, every business, every church pew. For Thomas Caldwell's shipping empire, neutrality was survival. His contract stretched from southern tobacco plantations to northern textile mills. To choose one side meant to forfeit the other, but neutrality in a time of gathering war is a lie that cannot endure. While her husband struggled to maintain balance between two burning worlds, Elizabeth Caldwell drifted further into enigma. Dr. Hartwell presented her case to the Maryland State Medical Society in 1855, describing anomalous aging patterns that defied every expectation. His colleagues dismissed it as error, vanity, or fraud. Yet quietly, they began to notice the same thing. Surgeons who had not seen her in 15 years would swear under oath that she was unchanged. Midwives attending her daughters' births whispered about her untouched beauty as if it were a curse. And still she lived outwardly as any woman of refinement should, attending church, hosting gatherings, supporting her husband's business. But in private journals, unease deepened. Physicians noted her accelerated recovery from injury, her uncanny vitality during sickness, her refusal to weaken even when those around her faltered. She seemed to exist in a state of equilibrium no one else could sustain. And yet, the price of such a condition was isolation. Rumors thickened. Some claimed she had discovered a hidden European tonic, a tincture brewed from rare herbs. Others whispered of darker arts, of bargains struck in secret with powers unnamed. The truth was less theatrical and infinitely more unsettling. She did not appear to be resisting time. She appeared to be outside it. By 1860, Reverend Wickham wrote again in his diary, his tone shifting from curiosity to fear. She has not aged since I first beheld her in 1841. I now believe this not to be blessing but trial, a reminder that heaven and hell alike may walk unseen in our midst. And then, as the storm of war broke across the nation, the veil around Elizabeth's existence would tear wider. For on April 19, 1861, during the Baltimore riot that spilled the first Union blood on Maryland soil, her secret would be thrust into the open. April 19, 1861, the city of Baltimore convulsed in violence. Union troops marching through on their way to Washington were met with jeers, stones, and gunfire. Streets that only days earlier had echoed with church bells and carriage wheels now ran red with blood. The riot left bodies sprawled on Pratt Street, the first casualties of a war not yet declared in full. In the chaos, witnesses reported a scene they could not reconcile. Elizabeth Caldwell, trapped near the Millie as soldiers fired into the crowd, was struck down by a musket ball that tore across her shoulder and chest. Several men swore she collapsed instantly, blood pooling into her silk dress, but within moments she rose, not staggering, not wounded, but upright, steady, her eyes cold with focus. She pulled her shawl over the blood-stained fabric and walked calmly into an alley, vanishing as if she had merely stepped into shadow. Dr. Hartwell's records from that day are damning. He writes, "A wound that should have been mortal left no lasting trace. Within 2 days she bore no scar. The skin was unbroken, the tissue restored. It is beyond surgery, beyond nature. I am left to conclude that she inhabits a state beyond the laws governing flesh." For Baltimore society, whispers hardened into terror. A woman who did not age was curiosity. A woman who could not die was blasphemy. In salons and parlors, her name became code for the uncanny. Guests who once admired her beauty now avoided her gaze. Ministers invoked her in sermons as a warning of pride against God's order. And yet, within her household, Elizabeth remained composed, neither confirming nor denying the stories. Her children noticed first what others ignored, that while their faces carried the lines of growing into adulthood, their mothers never shifted. By 1863, Margaret was 21, already betrothed, yet her mother looked like her sister. When Thomas Jinder marched off to fight for the Confederacy, he wrote to his fiancée, "I dread the war less than I dread the mystery of my mother, who seems untouched by years while all the rest of us fall into them like sand." The war ended in ruin and blood, but Elizabeth emerged untouched. Her husband's fortune was diminished, yet she retained her place in society, as though history itself bent to accommodate her. But those around her, physicians, ministers, even her children, now carried a question none dared ask aloud. What force held her outside the reach of time? By the close of the Civil War, Elizabeth Caldwell's life appeared outwardly stable. A widow now, for Thomas Caldwell died suddenly in 1866 of a fever that swept Baltimore's waterfront. He aged before his time, his hair turned white, his body frail, while Elizabeth stood at his funeral looking no older than the bride he had wed 3 decades earlier. To those gathered, the sight was unbearable. A wife untouched by grief's hand, at least in appearance, stirred whispers of witchcraft, of unnatural covenants. It was in these years that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell, still obsessed with her case, uncovered what he believed to be the first evidence of deliberate preservation. Among the late Mr. Caldwell's belongings was a small locked chest, inside which Hartwell found a set of notebooks written in Elizabeth's hand. They were not diaries in the usual sense, but collections of copied texts, fragments of scripture, invocations, and medical formulae that reached far beyond ordinary remedies. One passage, inked in a steady hand, read, "If flesh be bound to cycles of decay, then bind the flesh to symbols older than decay. If the body be vessel, let the vessel be sealed against time by word and fire." Hartwell did not publish these findings. He feared ridicule and ruin. But in his private journal he noted symbols resembling early Rosicrucian diagrams and Kabbalistic signs. He speculated that Elizabeth had stumbled upon or inherited a ritual practice that blended religion, alchemy, and proto-medical experimentation. Neighbors, too, began to observe strange habits. She walked alone at midnight through the family's gardens, carrying a small lantern, murmuring words no one could decipher. Servants reported the burning of herbs and salts in her chambers, the smell lingering for hours. One maid claimed to see her drawing circles in ash upon her bedroom floor. The story spread quietly among the staff, until the maid left suddenly, never to speak of it again. Her children, now adults, lived in conflict with their mother's enigma. Margaret moved to Boston, rarely visiting. Thomas Jr., embittered and broken from the war, accused her of mocking God with her eternal youth. Only Sarah remained close, though even she wrote to a cousin in 1869, "She looks as though she will bury us all. I sometimes think she already knows this." It was during this period that the first reports emerged of strangers visiting the Caldwell home. Men in clerical garb, foreign scholars, seekers of secrets. They did not come for Thomas's shipping ledgers. They came for Elizabeth. By the 1870s, the Caldwell mansion on Charles Street was no longer simply a residence. It had become a destination. Strangers arrived at odd hours. Scholars from Europe, cloaked men who spoke in foreign tongues, even a Jesuit priest rumored to have traveled from Rome under a false name. They came with questions unfit for polite society. And all of them, in hushed tones, sought only her. Neighbors noticed the carriages pulling up at midnight, the visitors who departed pale and shaken before dawn. Some claimed they heard chanting behind the Caldwell walls, others that they saw firelight flickering in upper windows, long after the household should have slept. To Baltimore's gossiping elite, these rumors hardened Elizabeth's legend. She was no longer merely the woman who did not age. She was the woman who held knowledge, the kind that men crossed oceans and risked reputations to obtain. Dr. Hartwell, still documenting every sighting, recorded an incident in 1872 that left him deeply unsettled. A French physician, Dr. Armand Duval, sought out Elizabeth, bringing with him ancient medical manuscripts. After a week in her company, Duval confided privately to Hartwell, "She does not simply preserve herself. She conducts rites of separation, separating the soul from decay, binding it to forms I scarcely understand. I dared not remain longer." Within months, Duval returned to Paris, only to vanish without a trace. His disappearance was noted in French police records. The clergy, too, turned their gaze upon her. Reverend Wickham, by now an old man, delivered sermons warning of a woman who lives beyond her appointed span, whose house is a beacon for the curious and the damned alike. Yet he never named her directly. To do so, parishioners whispered, was to invite her attention. Her children bore the weight of this notoriety. Margaret refused to let her mother see her grandchildren, claiming, "The woman in that house is not my mother, but a mask that has worn her face for 40 years. Thomas Jr. sank deeper into bitterness, convinced her survival mocked his own decline. Only Sarah, loyal to the end, stayed close, though her letters betray the strain. I cannot tell whether she is my mother or something that has replaced her. And so the legend of Elizabeth Caldwell grew, whispered in taverns, written in secret letters, hinted at in medical conferences. A woman untouched by time, sought by priests and scholars alike, and in the shadows of Baltimore, some began to call her by a name unspoken in daylight, the immortal widow. By 1875, the whispers surrounding Elizabeth Caldwell no longer belonged only to Baltimore. They had drifted down the corridors of Washington into the ears of politicians, bankers, and men whose fortunes depended not only on trade, but on the careful management of secrets. For such men, immortality was not a superstition. It was an asset to be studied, controlled, or possessed. Reports survive in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution that suggest Elizabeth's name appeared in correspondence between members of the Philosophical Society of Philadelphia and certain congressmen in Washington. One letter dated March 1876 reads, "The widow of Caldwell exhibits properties not unlike those described in alchemical records of Prague and Vienna. If she consents to examination, we may at last confirm what has long been dismissed as legend." Her home, by then, had become a salon of forbidden discourse. Men in fine coats and women in silks gathered not for dances or dinners, but for quiet discussions about preservation of the body, transference of the soul, and what one guest called the arithmetic of eternity. The Caldwell's drawing room became a laboratory of philosophy, and her presence the ultimate proof. For every skeptic who entered, there was one more convert who left believing she was the key to something larger. Secret societies began to circle. A surviving ledger from the Freemasons of Baltimore records, a woman of peculiar longevity, consulted in confidence. The Rosicrucians, whose American chapter was taking root, reportedly dispatched envoys to request her manuscripts. Even the Catholic Church, alarmed at rumors of her invulnerability, is said to have sent investigators cloaked as ordinary parishioners. Dr. Hartwell, still her reluctant chronicler, grew increasingly fearful. In his 1878 notes he wrote, "It is no longer the woman herself who is in danger, but all who seek her. They come believing they will learn her secret. They leave broken or worse. I fear her house is a crucible where faith, science, and ambition are consumed alike." Meanwhile, Elizabeth herself seemed unbothered. She dressed modestly, attended the opera, and walked the streets with the calm of one who knew time was her servant. But those closest to her, her daughter Sarah, and a dwindling circle of loyal servants, noticed the change. She spoke less of family, less of earthly matters, and more often of symbols, of cycles, of the eternal binding that men have forgotten. Her legend was no longer confined to Baltimore gossip. It had become currency in circles where power and secrecy intermingled, and that currency would soon draw a price. By the late 1870s, Elizabeth Caldwell's quiet defiance of time had ceased to be only a curiosity. It had become a provocation. Too many men had entered her home with questions of power, and too many had left either shaken, obsessed, or never returned at all. In 1879, a Washington lawyer named Henry Alcott traveled to Baltimore to meet her, bringing with him documents tied to early American esoteric societies. He was last seen entering the Caldwell residence one winter evening. His body was never recovered, though his cane was later discovered floating in the harbor, its ivory handle cracked clean in half. Police inquiries were cursory. A man of secrets had vanished in a city of shadows, yet in private correspondence, Alcott's colleagues wrote plainly, "He went in search of the widow, and she swallowed him whole." Other disappearances followed. A Jesuit scholar from Georgetown, a German chemist, 2 physicians from Philadelphia. All had been seen in her company, all vanished without a trace. The newspapers never dared connect her name to the mysteries, but Baltimore's undercurrent of rumor turned feverish. Mothers warned their daughters not to walk near Charles Street at night. Dock workers muttered that she was a lamia, a woman who drained men of life. Dr. Hartwell, still taking notes with the precision of a man chained to his obsession, described her house in those years as a sanctum where the ordinary laws of cause and effect collapse. He claimed that when he visited in 1880, he saw no servants, no ordinary signs of life. The rooms were immaculate yet cold, lit only by candles that burned with unusual longevity, and in the parlor, Elizabeth herself, radiant and unchanged, speaking in a voice he described as measured, yet burdened with centuries she has not lived. By then, even her loyal daughter Sarah began to falter. In a letter dated 1881, she confided to her cousin, "I feel that the air itself clings to her in ways I cannot endure. She speaks of eternity as one might speak of an inheritance, and I fear I no longer recognize the woman who bore me." For the first time, Elizabeth Caldwell was not only whispered about but hunted. Men came not to question but to capture. They believed her body, if taken, might yield the secret of her endless youth. What they did not understand was that Elizabeth had already prepared for such a moment, and those who tried to seize her would discover just how far beyond mortality she had stepped. The first attempt came on a rain, slick night in the spring of 1882. 3 men, masked and armed, forced their way into the Caldwell mansion. Neighbors later swore they heard no struggle, only the sudden extinguishing of every lamp in the house, a darkness that seemed to spill outward onto Charles Street itself. By morning, the doors of the mansion stood open, the rain still dripping from their brass hinges. The 3 intruders were gone. Only their pistols remained, neatly arranged on the parlor table, as if placed there by careful hands. Word spread quickly through Baltimore. The story could not be printed, but it did not need to be. Dockside taverns hummed with the tale of the widow's house, where men vanished into silence. Ministers thundered from pulpits about divine wrath. And yet, beneath the fear, another current ran: fascination. For every man who swore he would never step near her home, there were 2 who whispered of attempting it themselves. The second attempt was more brazen. In 1884, a group of self-styled occultists from New York traveled south, carrying with them iron restraints, ritual texts, and the arrogance of men convinced they could outwit eternity. They entered the mansion on a summer's night. Only one emerged, babbling incoherently on Lombard Street at dawn. His skin bore burns in the shape of circles, and his hair had turned white overnight. He died in an asylum within weeks, but not before scrawling a final message onto his cell wall. "She is the fire that does not consume. She is the mouth that does not close." Dr. Hartwell, though he did not witness these events firsthand, received accounts from sources he trusted. In his 1885 journal, he wrote, "The attempts to bind her body fail because they mistake the body for the essence. She is not preserved by flesh alone. There is something else, something anchored beyond the reach of iron, beyond the blade, beyond fire. Whatever covenant she has bound herself to, it holds." By now, Elizabeth Caldwell had ceased to be a woman in the minds of her neighbors. She was legend. A figure mothers evoked to silence unruly children, a presence sailors invoked before long voyages. Some whispered her name in prayers, not to God but to her, as if eternity itself might be persuaded. And still, through all the fear and fascination, she walked calmly through Baltimore's streets, her eyes fixed ahead, untouched by time. By the late 1880s, Elizabeth Caldwell was no longer just Baltimore's whispered ghost. Her legend had seeped into the national imagination. Traveling lecturers spoke of her in Boston and Philadelphia, presenting her as a living riddle, a case that defied both scripture and science. Newspapers, careful to avoid her name, hinted at a lady of refinement in Maryland who had not aged in 50 years. To a nation enthralled by seances, spirit photography, and scientific marvels, she was irresistible. Journalists arrived, their notebooks hidden, their questions cloaked in politeness. They hoped to catch a glimpse, to prove or disprove the impossible. Some returned with careful sketches of a woman, with the face of 25 but the bearing of 70. Others returned with nothing at all, swearing they had been turned away by a servant who did not speak. A few vanished, their dispatches unfinished, their editors left only with fragments of letters describing strange lights in the upper windows. The skeptics too descended. In 1887, Dr. Jonathan P. Whittaker, a Harvard physiologist, published a scathing essay declaring Elizabeth a fraud sustained by cosmetics, exaggerations, and provincial superstition. Within months, Whittaker vanished while traveling through Maryland. His luggage was found at a Baltimore hotel. His body was not. Dr. Hartwell, aging now and weakened by illness, watched the spectacle unfold with both awe and dread. He had documented Elizabeth for nearly 5 decades, and though he could no longer visit her in person, he received letters in her distinctive hand. One dated October 1888 read simply, You see me as anomaly, but I am the inevitable. You are born into time, I stepped out of it. Do not seek to explain what was never meant to be explained. For Hartwell, the words were confirmation that she no longer saw herself as merely human. She had crossed a threshold and embraced the mantle her city, and now her nation had thrust upon her. Meanwhile, Sarah, her last loyal child, grew frail and ill. Neighbors often saw her carried into carriages, her body wasting while her mother's remained untouched. In private, Sarah confided to friends, "She will live to bury me, and when she does, she will walk alone in a world that cannot understand her." By the turn of the decade, Elizabeth Caldwell had become a paradox. The entire country could not look away from a widow who had outlived time itself. The winter of 1890 brought with it a sorrow no ritual could shield against. Sarah Caldwell, Elizabeth's last remaining child, wasted away from a sickness doctors could not name. She had been her mother's shadow, the only one of the Caldwell children to remain faithful, to endure the endless strangeness of living beside a woman who did not change. Yet even Sarah, bound by blood and loyalty, could not endure the weight of mortality. Dr. Hartwell recorded his final visit that January. He described Elizabeth sitting at Sarah's bedside, calm as stone, her hand resting lightly over her daughter's fevered brow. Sarah's face was hollow, her breath ragged, while Elizabeth's features glowed with the vitality of a woman half her daughter's age. It was, Hartwell wrote, a tableau more terrible than any graveyard, the mother radiant, the daughter perishing. When Sarah finally succumbed in February, the funeral drew whispers louder than prayers. Guests recoiled at the sight of Elizabeth, veiled in black but looking not a day older than when Sarah had first entered the world. Neighbors muttered that death itself seemed unable to touch her household, save to take everyone but her. One mourner was overheard saying, "She buries them as we bury seasons. It is not natural." After Sarah's passing, the Caldwell mansion grew unbearably silent. Servants left, unable to bear the solitude of its halls. Elizabeth was seen less often in public, though when she did appear, she remained unchanged. Ageless amid a city that grew old around her, children who once feared her as a ghost now grew into adults who regarded her as a curse, and the cycle of suspicion renewed itself with every generation. In this solitude, Elizabeth seemed to lean deeper into the practices that had sustained her. Hartwell's notes describe reports of strange lights in her windows, chanting that carried faintly on the wind, and the smell of burning herbs, even in the dead of winter. Though he no longer dared confront her directly, he admitted in one of his last journal entries, "Her grief does not diminish her, it fortifies her. She is more resolute now than ever, and I fear what such resolve may yield." With her last child gone, Elizabeth Caldwell became untethered, not a mother, but a being suspended between time and eternity. And for those who watched her, she was no longer simply a woman. She was an omen. After Sarah's death, the Caldwell mansion no longer seemed part of Baltimore's living city. Its shutters closed, its gardens overgrown, its windows dim, except for the occasional flicker of firelight in the upper rooms. Neighbors crossed the street rather than walk beside its iron gates. They said the air around the house felt colder, as though the building itself exhaled grief. But grief was not the only presence. Servants who had once worked within those halls began to tell stories. One, a chambermaid who fled in 1892, claimed she heard footsteps pacing in the corridors long after Elizabeth had retired to her chamber. Another swore she saw figures, pale, indistinct, moving through mirrors as though trapped behind the glass. A gardener, dismissed without warning, told tavern companions that the earth of the Caldwell yard refused to hold roots, as if the soil itself rejected life. Soon the mansion became more than a home, it was a haunting. Children dared one another to touch its gates at night. Stray dogs would not pass near its fence. And in the silence of winter evenings, residents swore they could hear the faint sound of chanting carried on the wind, drifting from the Caldwell windows like the echo of a forgotten liturgy. Dr. Hartwell, though now an old man himself, could not turn away from the mystery he had pursued for half a century. In 1893 he wrote, "The house is no longer ordinary space. It has become an extension of her, a vessel like the body itself bound against time. Where others see ghosts, I see the reflection of her refusal, her defiance against the very order of decay." though Elizabeth herself was rarely seen, though when she did appear in public, at markets, at the opera, walking alone along the harbour, she looked precisely as she had 30 years before. Her presence caused silence to ripple through crowds. Men removed their hats instinctively, women averted their eyes. It was not reverence, it was fear. By now, her name was no longer spoken aloud in Baltimore parlors. She had become a myth told in hushed voices, a story to frighten children, a riddle to vex scholars. The Caldwell mansion was her fortress and her prison, and the city around it seemed resigned to endure her as one endures a storm that never passes. By the final decade of the 19th century, Elizabeth Caldwell's existence was no longer merely a Baltimore legend. Newspapers from Boston to New Orleans carried brief, nervous articles about the woman who never ages. Spiritualist journals printed woodcut portraits of her, sometimes flattering, sometimes grotesque, each accompanied by theories that ranged from angelic blessing to demonic pact. The rise of the Say Ain'ts movement made her name currency among mediums who claimed to channel her immortal essence for paying audiences. Yet none could produce her presence, and all were eventually exposed as frauds. In 1895, the matter reached the halls of Washington. The newly established Bureau of Ethnology, tasked with documenting unusual phenomena across the nation, dispatched 2 investigators to Baltimore. Officially, they were to study folk legends of the Chesapeake region. Unofficially, they sought Elizabeth Caldwell. Their reports, preserved in sealed government files, describe careful surveillance of the Caldwell mansion. They noted visitors arriving only at night, deliveries of supplies taken through back entrances, and most disturbingly, the repeated appearance of Elizabeth herself at irregular intervals, unchanged in form. One investigator wrote, "If she is mortal, her years defy mathematics. If she is something else, then we study not a woman but a rupture in the order of creation itself." The press soon caught wind of federal interest, and Baltimore was overrun with fortune seekers, mystics, and charlatans. Some camped outside the Caldwell property, claiming they could feel vibrations of eternal energy emanating from the walls. A preacher from Virginia declared her the War of Babylon, sent to tempt the faithful into worshipping the false promise of endless youth. Scientists came to anthropologists, biologists, even early photographers eager to fix her image onto glass plates that might reveal what the human eye could not. Elizabeth's response was silence. She neither opened her doors nor answered questions. On the rare occasions she appeared, she carried herself with the same unearthly composure, acknowledging neither the fear nor the frenzy that followed her. Yet her stillness, her refusal to explain, only magnified the obsession. Baltimore could no longer contain her legend. The Caldwell mansion became a pilgrimage site for those seeking forbidden truths. Some swore the air grew thin near its gates, that watches stopped ticking, that wounds healed more swiftly after lingering in its shadow. And while the crowd pressed against her iron fence, Elizabeth Caldwell watched from behind lace curtains, not as a woman defending her privacy, but as something else entirely, a sentinel guarding a secret the world was not ready to bear. The dawn of the 20th century brought with it new tools and new hungers. X-rays, photographic plates, the burgeoning fields of eugenics and experimental medicine. For many scientists, Elizabeth Caldwell was no longer a curiosity. She was an anomaly to be measured, dissected, explained. In 1902, a team of physicians from Johns Hopkins sent a formal letter requesting permission to examine her. The proposal was polite, couched in the language of research and national progress. They promised discretion, they promised dignity, they promised to record only what she consented to reveal. The letter received no reply. Undeterred, one physician attempted to obtain her likeness through long-distance photography. Stationed across the harbor with a telephoto lens, he captured a series of plates. When developed, the images were clouded, not blurred, but clouded as though a film of smoke had risen from the emulsion itself. The man repeated the process twice more, each time with fresh equipment, each time with the same result. In his journal he wrote, "It is not that the machine fails, it is that she refuses to be captured." Meanwhile, the rising discipline of eugenics seized upon her name. If her agelessness was biological, they argued, then her bloodline might hold the key to humanity's future. A paper presented in London in 1904 speculated that Elizabeth was the bearer of an uncorrupted strain. immune to degeneration. Advocates spoke openly of securing her donation, not of money but of her body, her blood, even her reproductive capacity. This shift was darker than superstition. Superstition feared her. Science coveted her. Elizabeth herself gave no indication of fear or retreat. She continued to appear at select functions, always veiled, always composed, her beauty untarnished by the years that were now turning her contemporaries to dust. At one opera, a whispered rumor swept through the balcony. The young woman in pearls was older than the building itself. By 1910, she had lived through 3 generations without changing. Her servants, her neighbors, even the men who once courted her were long buried. Yet she remained a fixed point in a world of rot and renewal. The more progress marched forward, the more Elizabeth Caldwell stood as its rebuke. Against electricity, against X-rays, against the machines of war and industry, she was the immovable truth, a reminder that science could invent but not yet explain. The world lurched into fire in 1914, Europe blood itself white, and even across the Atlantic the United States felt the tremors of war. Baltimore's harbor was filled with troop ships, and its streets echoed with parades of young men marching off to a conflict that would devour them. Yet through it all, Elizabeth Caldwell remained untouched. She was seen only rarely during those years, most often walking at twilight through her overgrown gardens. Soldiers on leave swore they glimpsed her behind the wrought iron gates, pale as moonlight, her posture as erect and graceful as it had been half a century before. One veteran of the trenches wrote in a letter to his sister, "The world crumbles, yet here is a woman who stands unchanged. If such a thing is possible, then perhaps death itself can be cheated." Rumors spread among the wounded. Some claimed that a sip of water taken from the Caldwell estate's well could heal shattered limbs. Others whispered that Elizabeth had sheltered deserters within her mansion, promising them safety at a price no one dared to name. Nothing could be proven. The house remained sealed, its gates locked, its curtains drawn. In 1918, as influenza swept across the globe, Baltimore lost thousands in a matter of weeks. Priests carried carts of the dead through neighborhoods. The bells of churches tolled without pause. And yet, the Caldwell house did not hang black creep upon its doors. No coffin was seen borne from its halls. Not one servant was reported ill. The mansion stood in eerie silence while the city suffocated around it. The war ended, the plague subsided, but Elizabeth emerged unchanged. When she walked once more along the harbor in 1919, she looked not like a survivor of catastrophe, but like someone entirely outside it. Women who had lost husbands stared at her with hatred. Men who had lost sons crossed themselves as she passed. The city itself seemed to recoil, for she had become a reminder of everything they had lost, and of what she could never lose. By then, whispers began again that her survival was no accident, that perhaps war and pestilence, far from threatening her, had been orchestrated to sustain her, that the world paid its blood so she could remain unbroken. And with that whisper, the legend of Elizabeth Caldwell darkened into something far more sinister, no longer a woman who defied time, but a woman who fed upon it. The world emerged from war craving distraction, and the 1920s supplied it in abundance. Jazz, cinema, radio, a fever of modernity that promised to drown memory in noise. But Elizabeth Caldwell, unchanging, stood like a shadow behind the roaring lights. If she had once been a hushed rumor in Baltimore, now she was a spectacle. Spiritualists, sensing opportunity, revived her name. Traveling mediums claimed to channel her mortal current during seances, selling tickets to eager audiences. A theater troupe in New York staged a play thinly disguised as her biography, depicting a woman who bargained with Satan for eternal youth. Tabloids published outlandish sketches of her, some rendering her as a goddess of light, others as a corpse preserved in perfume. And though Elizabeth herself never appeared on stage or in print, the very refusal only deepened the obsession. By 1923, Hollywood entered the fray. Silent film producers, eager for the next sensation, dispatched scouts to Baltimore in hopes of securing the rights to her story. They wrote letters, telegrams, even sent a famous actress to knock at her door. No response ever came. The project collapsed, but fragments of the screenplay survive. Scenes of a pale woman striding through centuries while empires crumbled at her feet. Meanwhile, profiteers worked closer to home. Hawkers near the Caldwell mansion sold postcards bearing crude etchings of her face. Others bottled ordinary water, labeling it "from the eternal spring," and sold it to desperate buyers as an elixir. Crowds gathered nightly outside her gates, some praying, some jeering, some waiting for even the briefest glimpse of her figure at the window. Inside, Elizabeth remained as silent as ever. Witnesses say she was seen only once during that decade, stepping from her carriage outside the opera in 1927. She wore pearls, her gown gleaming under the gas lamps, her face radiant and untouched by time. The crowd that recognized her did not cheer. They froze, then whispered, then scattered, as though confronted with something unholy. To the young she became a carnival tale. To the old, she was a blasphemy. And to those who studied history, Elizabeth Caldwell was now more than a local legend. She was proof, whispered proof, that the boundaries of human life could be broken. Yet, for all the noise of jazz and cinema, the mansion's silence endured. She did not sell her story. She did not explain her years. She waited as though time itself were her audience, and she alone dictated the performance. The crash of 1929 shattered illusions of endless prosperity. Banks collapsed, bread lines snaked through Baltimore's streets, and families who once hosted glittering soirees now pawned their heirlooms for a week's survival. Amid this ruin, the Caldwell mansion stood untouched, its windows glowing faintly, its gates rusting but unbroken, and Elizabeth Caldwell remained as she had always been, untouched by time, untouched by hunger, untouched by despair. This contrast ignited fury. Neighbors whispered that while children starved, Elizabeth's kitchens remained full, her gardens still green, her servants still paid. Some swore they had seen delivery wagons unloading flour and meats at her back door in the dead of night. Even when the city's markets had nothing left to sell, others claimed the mansion's chimneys belched no smoke, yet food was cooked within. Resentment thickened into paranoia. In 1932, a group of unemployed dockworkers gathered outside her gates, shouting curses. "Share your secret," they demanded. "Give us what you hoard." Police dispersed them before stones could shatter her windows. But the seed was planted. Elizabeth was no longer only a curiosity. She was a scapegoat, a symbol of everything cruel and unequal in the world. Whispers grew darker still. Ministers thundered from pulpits that she thrived on despair, that the suffering of millions was the cost of her unbroken beauty. Pamphlets circulated suggesting she had struck a bargain with forces that demanded famine, war, and ruin in exchange for her eternal youth. One even claimed she was not a woman at all, but a vessel through which history itself fed upon humanity's pain. And yet, through these storms of accusation, Elizabeth did not falter. In 1934, she was glimpsed walking along the harbor in the company of no one, her face serene, her posture regal. Men hollow-eyed from hunger stopped and stared, some spat, others wept openly. But she gave no sign of notice. Her indifference, or perhaps her detachment, was more haunting than cruelty. The Depression broke cities, ruined dynasties, and toppled governments. But it did not touch her. To many, this was proof of the darkest suspicion that Elizabeth Caldwell was not merely surviving history, but feasting on it. By the decade's end, her legend had hardened. No longer a fairy tale of eternal youth, she was something else. A specter of greed, a silent witness to suffering, a reminder that in the shadows of despair, some forces endure not because they resist time, but because they demand sacrifice. In September 1939, the world once again collapsed into war. Europe burned, and though America would not enter for 2 more years, Baltimore's docks thundered with activity. Steel ships, weapons, and men flowing toward the Atlantic. Amid the fever of mobilization, the Caldwell mansion loomed as silent as ever. Yet this time, Elizabeth's legend attracted attention far more dangerous than tabloid writers or spiritualist frauds. Governments began to take notice. By 1941, intelligence agencies whispered of her existence. A British officer passing through Baltimore recorded in his diary that, "Woman of unnatural longevity resides here, whose case may be of interest to His Majesty's government." Shortly after Pearl Harbor, a pair of plainclothes men, believed to be from the fledgling Office of Strategic Services, were seen lingering near the Caldwell gates. What they sought was obvious. In an age of chemical warfare, secret medicines, and experiments in endurance, Elizabeth Caldwell represented the ultimate military advantage. If she could not die, could her condition be replicated in soldiers? Neighbors claimed she received visits that year from men in dark coats who arrived in government cars and departed at odd hours. No papers recorded their names, but files declassified decades later confirm an OSS case file 742, subject Caldwell. Most of the pages remain blacked out, but one line survives. If real, she represents both a threat and an opportunity beyond measure. Whispers spread among soldiers shipping out from Baltimore. Some swore they had seen Elizabeth near the docks, standing apart from the crowd, her gaze fixed upon the departing men. She was marking us. One veteran later said, as if she already knew who would not return. The war brought death on an unimaginable scale, yet Elizabeth remained unchanged. By 1945, entire neighborhoods had emptied of young men, but when she walked once more through her garden, she looked exactly as she had when Lincoln was alive. Her silence became unbearable. For a city soaked in sacrifice, her survival was more than uncanny. It was obscene. Was she a blessing denied to others, or a curse loosed upon the world? The question no longer belonged to Baltimore alone. In an era of atomic fire and global ruin, Elizabeth Caldwell had become an international enigma, a woman untouched by history, even as history consumed everything else. The guns of World War II fell silent, but peace was an illusion. By 1947, the Cold War had begun, and the world split into rival empires. Atomic fire loomed over every horizon, and in the shadows, intelligence agencies expanded their reach. In this new age of paranoia, Elizabeth Caldwell's legend was no longer the subject of rumor. It was a classified concern. Declassified fragments from early CIA memoranda speak of asset potential, subject EC. Her name appears alongside projects aimed at psychological warfare, mind control, and biological experimentation. The Soviets, too, took notice. Defectors claimed that Moscow circulated reports of an American woman ageless since the mid-19th century, who may hold genetic keys to indefinite survival. To both sides, she was not a myth but a weapon waiting to be seized. Baltimore residents noticed black cars parked longer than usual along the Caldwell estate. Men with cameras lingered across the street, pretending to smoke cigarettes while taking notes. Some nights, unmarked vans rolled up to her gates only to be turned away without fanfare. Each time, Elizabeth remained untouched, as though the very act of forcing her compliance was unthinkable, even to the most ruthless agencies of power. And yet, strange stories filtered back from operatives who had come too close. One man, assigned to photograph her through a long-range lens, developed his film only to find each frame corrupted, not blurred but warped, as though the emulsion itself had melted. Another reportedly suffered a breakdown after a single encounter, claiming he had looked into her eyes and seen the span of centuries unbroken, staring back. For ordinary Americans, her legend flickered in whispers, half buried beneath news of career McCarthyism and nuclear drills. But in secret files, she was a constant. Reports describe urgent debates over whether she represented a divine miracle, a biological anomaly, or something altogether outside human comprehension. One marginal note in a CIA briefing reads simply, "If she cannot be killed, she cannot be controlled." Elizabeth herself never engaged. She walked her gardens, appeared occasionally in Baltimore's harbor district, and then vanished again into the silence of her house. She seemed untouched by ideology, unmoved by the clash of empires. To the world tearing itself apart in fear, her very stillness was unbearable. By mid-century, Elizabeth Caldwell was no longer just a woman. She was a secret more coveted than the bomb, and far less understood. The 1960s cracked America wide open. Cities burned with civil rights marches and riots. Presidents and prophets were struck down by bullets. Young men were shipped to Vietnam, while their sisters and lovers filled the streets in protest. The nation pulsed with rebellion, violence, and a hunger for meaning. And through it all, Elizabeth Caldwell remained. To some, she became a symbol, whispered of in smoky dorm rooms and underground cafes. Youths who rejected their parents' world pointed to her as proof that the old order had secrets they hoarded, powers denied to the masses. Radical pamphlets claimed she embodied the hidden wealth of elites, a living monument to privilege. Others, more mystical, imagined her as a timeless oracle, a witness to every failure of humanity, carrying history's unbroken chain within her eyes. In 1963, as Kennedy's motorcade was ambushed in Dallas, Baltimore residents swore Elizabeth was seen walking calmly through the city's theater district, dressed in black silk, as if mourning long before the rest of the nation knew grief. After King's assassination in 1968, rumors claimed she stood on her balcony at midnight, her face lit faintly by lightning, gazing at a world she had watched collapse countless times before. The government files that trailed her grew thicker, then suddenly thin. By the end of the decade, reports dwindled. Surveillance teams noted fewer sightings. The mansion's curtains stayed drawn. For the first time in more than a century, Elizabeth Caldwell seemed to retreat fully from the public eye. Some said she had finally tired of humanity's chaos. Others believed she had simply chosen another mask, stepping into a new identity, leaving the Caldwell name behind. And there were those, the faithful few, who whispered that she remained inside those iron gates, waiting, her body untouched, her secret sealed, until the world was ready to face her again. Baltimore moved on. The city changed, industries crumbled, neighborhoods fell and rose. But the Caldwell mansion still stands, its windows dark, its gardens overgrown, its silence unbroken. Children dare one another to touch its gates. Tourists lower their voices as they pass. And late at night, some swear they see a figure at the window, a woman with a face too perfect, too still, too timeless. Elizabeth Caldwell is no longer history. She is legend. And legends, unlike flesh, never die.